There's a wonderful line by the poet Muriel Rukeyser, "The world is not made out of atoms, it's made out of stories."
Change their lives for the better.
Human tendency is to hope.
But the stories we tell about who we are shape our lives.
My name is Daniel Alarcón, and my novel is called Lost City Radio. There's a lot of ideas behind the book. I think a novel has a lot of different sort of origins. In this particular case, the novel is about a woman named Norma, who is the host of this really big radio program that is the same name as the title of the novel, Lost City Radio. And one day a boy arrives at the radio station and he has a list, and on that list is the name of people who've gone missing from his village. We're in a giant sort of chaotic third world capital, about 10 years removed from a very violent political struggle. And on that list is a name that Norma recognizes. And the whole question of the novel is, how did that name get to be on that list? In the present tense, it's very brief. It's maybe 2 days. But in the past, to understand how all that happened, you have to go back and tell the entire history of the struggle and the conflict in this country. So it's a story that's very much about history and about political conflict and about how things fall apart, I suppose. Well, I think my book is about democracy in the sense that democracy is messy, and the conflict that I'm describing is essentially an assault upon the idea of free discourse and the exchange of ideas. Once violence enters a discussion, sort of the only path things can take is to degenerate and to shut off conversation. And there's all types of violence in the book. There's the violence of extreme poverty. There's the violence, of a car bomb. There's the violence of a political assassination. There's the violence of, army oppression. There's the violence of secret police and state surveillance, all of which serve to, in my opinion, sort of destroy the very foundation of democracy. The state that I describe is kind of a very extreme case, a very extreme representation of the situation in Peru in the 90s. So sort of this, a more bitter, a harder-edged version of the Fujimori regime, and it's sort of trying to pull Peru out of the war by clamping down on everything. So it's not really a democracy per se in the country that I describe. It's a kind of a state that traded in its democratic rights for a kind of stability, and that's not uncommon at all. I don't tend to think of, or I should say it this way, I don't respond well to the idea of writers and artists having responsibilities. If I wanted responsibilities, I would have become a doctor or something, I think my responsibility as an artist is to my characters and to my story. And, if I happen to be a person with political beliefs or, paying any sort of amount of attention to what's going on around me, inevitably some of that context is going to enter the book. But this is a big issue in Latin American literature. The idea of el escritor comprometido, the writer who is engaged, versus the writer who writes pieces of art and poetry that has nothing to do with the context. And there's always been this division. Either you're engaged or you're not engaged. And I sort of feel like that's a false dichotomy. So the reason I'm responding to the question this way is because I've heard it so many times in Latin America, people sort of shouting at me to be more engaged, or wondering why I'm not writing about this or not writing about that, or why I don't have a position on this in public, and I sort of have this visceral response against anything that sort of curtails my freedom as an artist to comment or not comment on whatever I want. Having said that, a lot of my work does deal with sort of social, political issues, and so I'm simply reserving the right to, in the future, ignore social, political issues if I so choose. I would say this. I think that that the way I write obviously comes out of my own experiences and my own upbringing and the books I read when I was young, and the experiences I had and the experiences my family had. So in my case, politics was always discussed. Excuse me, both American politics and Peruvian politics and Latin American politics in general. So it's clear that that had an impact on me, and that those sort of themes show up in my work. I think it's not an accident. I wouldn't say I'm passionate about politics. I mean, I think about politics a lot, and mostly with great disdain and disgust, and a fair amount of sort of admiring the grotesque spectacle of it. I think it's impossible not to pay attention to politics, and you either get very depressed or you just you admire the carnival. I mean, it's a bizarro world that has very little to do with the worlds that normal people live in. In Lost City Radio, one of the things that I tried to do, for example, is to create a world that's very affected by politics, but in which ideology is never discussed. So there's a terrorist group called the IL, the Legitimate Legion, which is not a name they chose for themselves. It's a name that was given to them. And they, you never have any sense of what ideology they are. I think of that old Buñuel movie, that obscure object of desire that has this, random terrorist group called the Revolutionary Army of Baby Jesus, that's just going around blowing up trains and stuff. And Buñuel just directly decides that he's going to point out the absurdity of terrorism just from the get-go. And so, with great respect for Buñuel, I toned it down a little bit, but I did want to sort of excise ideology because at the end of the day, I mean, whether they're Marxist, Leninist, or Trotsky, I find it super boring. And I remember, when I was researching the book, I spoke with a historian of the Peruvian left, a guy, his last name was Rojas, and he showed me this sort of family tree of the Peruvian left from the founding of the Peruvian Communist Party in the 1930s, and it reminded me of those maps of the Amazon, all these little capillaries, forming this, but backwards, so that, and then you start thinking, he's like, yeah, this cell had 4 people in it, this cell had 6 people in it. And you're just like, they all claim to be speaking for the people, but at the end of the day, it was like, a handful of dudes, splitting along very fine dogmatic lines. Violence is almost always arbitrary, and I think in the case of this novel, I wanted to show that there were no good guys. I find that that's fairly accurate. It's a fairly accurate representation of the Peruvian conflict, a fairly accurate representation of many sort of conflicts, that they begin in one place and they end up somewhere else. Certainly in the case of Peru, there were many atrocities committed by the army. And because the army represents us, because the army is part of a democratic state, we citizens rightly condemn those and denounce those acts. They are part of an elected state apparatus. So we should rightly condemn those, perhaps more so than we condemn, terrorist acts. If only because terrorists, in this case the IL, were not, we didn't choose the IL. The IL emerged. They made the choice to start, killing people, and of course that's deplorable as well, and it also must be denounced. It was very important for me in the novel to condemn violence as a tool for political discourse, and I thought it was important to condemn it on both sides. And I think it was it's accurate to the history to point out that there were atrocities committed on both sides. And there's a phrase that gets used a lot in Peru, entre dos fuegos, between two fires, to describe the position of many of the campesinos and people in the provinces who were forced to leave their homes and come to the city for refuge. They were between two fires, one fire being the army and the other fire being the Shining Path. And they hadn't chosen to be terrorized by either. They just simply happened to be in the wrong place, living in a battlefield. And sort of out of respect for that experience, I had to show this conflict the way it was, or the way I see it. I spent a lot of time talking with people when I was researching this book. I spent a lot of time talking with people who had been students, had been 22 years old, 25 years old in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, and sort of came to believe in a lot of the rhetoric that was being bandied about. In 1968 there was a military coup in Peru. A leftist military coup, and then in the early 1970s, he was overthrown, and there was a right-wing military government, and that hardened a lot of people's opinions. But a lot of young people sort of became entranced with the idea that that violence was the only way. The context is important. This is 1973, the overthrow of Allende in Chile. Democratically elected socialist government is overthrown by the army. And there were a lot of Peruvians studying in Santiago de Chile who, were tortured and then, sent away. And of course, they come back to Peru and they tell their stories of what happened in Chile, and that further radicalizes part of the Peruvian left. And the idea does become that there's a type of violence that spawns virtue, and that's a phrase from the novel, a type of violence that will, we will go through this cleansing fire and become a better people, a better state, a better nation, a more just nation. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that that's a fallacy. We can see that doesn't work, hasn't worked, can't work, because violence destroys the logic of progress. You can't make justice out of blood. I mean, it just can't happen. And I really wanted the novel to both make that point, but also explain and try to get inside the mindset of the people who made these choices, because they weren't crazy. There was a context that created them, and they made these choices, and we got to where we ended up. But it came out of something real.